One of the ways that the Gospels differ is in terms of their Christologies. Theologians use the word Christology to refer to the various ways that Christ is described, the various ways that the nature of Christ is distinguished. And the Christologies within the Gospels differ. That is, they see Christ in significantly different ways. And I mostly want to talk about the two extremes. But first I want to talk about the scale by which we measure Christologies, at least one of the scales. We'll talk about more later on in the semester. And this is the scale of a high Christology and a low Christology. And I don't want you to think of like a high Christology is good and a low Christology is bad. They're both extremes, and we need to understand both in order to understand the Christologies within the Christian tradition. So the highest of the high Christologies on the scale would be a Christology which would affirm that Christ is God and necessarily deny that Christ is a human being. That would make a really high Christology, a purely divine Christology. The Christian tradition has rejected that option, that particular construction, and affirms that Christ is truly a human being. If we go on the other side of the scale and look for the lowest Christology we could imagine, it would be a Christology that would describe Christ as purely a human being, not a divine being in any way different than the way you would say that any human being has a spark of divine. That would be an extremely low Christology. And these two extremes of high Christology and low Christology have both been historically rejected by the Christian tradition. The low Christology option probably having been rejected much more recently, when that becomes an option to think about. But in saying this, I don't want us to think that the Christian tradition places itself right in the middle of that scale. They do not. Rather, the Christian tradition places in its Gospels various places along that scale. So we're going to go from the lowest Christology Gospel of the Gospels in the New Testament, which is the Gospel of Mark, to the highest Christology Gospel in the New Testament, which is the Christology of the Gospel of John. And if you think about it for a moment, this shouldn't make a lot of difficulty for us. It's psychologically understandable that the gospel that was written earliest, the gospel that was written at a time when there actually were people within their community who remembered Jesus walking and talking and eating and sleeping with them. It makes sense that that would be the lowest Christology. It was easiest for the early church to think of Christ in terms of his humanity. Jump 60 years, however, 40 to 60 years to the writing of the Gospel of John, and all of a sudden there is no longer anybody who actually remembers the physical Jesus walking on earth. Instead, we have a large and increasingly growing community of followers of Jesus, of Christians, who are thinking about this man in the same terms that they were thinking about the Roman and Greek gods and goddesses that they had worshipped previously. And they naturally and very easily gravitated to the idea of Christ as a divine being. What was really difficult for them was to believe that Christ was actually a human. So the earliest gospel has the lowest Christology. The latest gospel has the highest Christology. However, neither one of these gospels work their way to one extreme or another. Rather, even though we have in Mark a very low Christology, what do we mean by that? We have very vivid and graphic depictions of of Jesus being tired, of Jesus being hungry, of Jesus getting angry and impatient and exhausted and frustrated and disillusioned. The humanity of Jesus comes out very clearly and very powerfully in the Gospel of Mark, even though we have very clear and unmistakable depictions in Mark of, for instance, Jesus forgiving sins. And this was understood by the Jewish religious structure as something that was only open to God. Only God could forgive sins. Jesus clearly forgives sins. Jesus walks on water. Jesus speaks to the wind and it listens to him. Jesus performs great acts of miraculous acts of healing and delivering people from demonic possessions. All these things, well, on a small scale, a Jewish magician would be able to perform a few of them. But taken to that degree and coupled with this claim of power to forgive sins and this defeat of death itself, we have a Christology in Mark that, although a low Christology, is not as low as you can go. That clearly the writer of the Gospel of Mark believes that Jesus is some kind of a divine being. The centurion at the end, seeing the circumstances of his crucifixion, not even his resurrection, just his crucifixion, he looks up and he says, surely this one was the Son of God, or perhaps a Son of God. So there is some divine qualities in the very human Jesus that's depicted in the Gospel of Mark. When we go to the other extreme, the Gospel of John, likewise, the Gospel of John starts at the beginning of time, at the creation of the world, and Christ is spoken of in the form of the Logos as being there. The Gospel of Mark begins with Jesus' baptism. The Gospels of Luke and Matthew begin with Jesus' birth and infancy and childhood. But it's only the Gospel of John that begins at the very beginning of time and places Christ there, a divine being who is both with God at the creation and also is God at the creation. If that confuses you, we'll be talking about the Trinity down the line, a class or two after this one. So he begins as a divine being, and he's also, John says that he's the one who is responsible for creating the world. He says, through him, that is, through the Logos, through Christ, all things came to be, and nothing has come into existence apart from him, that is, the Logos, the Christ. And if there's any doubt whatsoever about whom John is talking, he makes it explicit in the 14th verse of the first chapter. He says, and the Word, the Logos, was made flesh and dwelt among us. So this clearly identifies this divine being who was with God and who was God at the very beginning of creation. John identifies this figure as the one who was born, the one who walked among us. But this brings us to what I'd call the modification or the nuancing of John's very high Christology, because John insists that this Christ, this Logos, became flesh. And that's a very important choice of words for John. Became flesh. For there was, at John's time, groups of Christians who completely denied that the Christ ever truly came in the flesh. They say that Christ only seemed to come in the flesh. That's a higher Christology. But in fact, he was always just purely a divine being. John says no. Christ actually and truly came in the flesh. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So even though John has a very high Christology, treating Christ as a kind of divine being, kind of floating in and out of people's lives, he insists that Christ was actually a flesh and blood human being. So we make the extreme scales of high Christology, purely God, no human, or low Christology, purely human, no God, all of the canonical Gospels place themselves somewhere in the center, with Mark all the way over to the human side and John all the way over to the divine side, but not all the way there. Matthew and Luke placed somewhere in the middle.